For Lucas, from nobody to somebody. You'll never be anybody. The phrase cut through the silence of the room like a sharp blade. All eyes turned to Lucas, the new intern, who trembled before the arrogant boss. It was his first day at the company, and he was already being humiliated in front of everyone. Alberto's mocking laughter resonated like a punch to the chest. Lucas felt his face burn, as if the ground would swallow him at any moment. He had dreamed so much about this opportunity, but in seconds it was crushed by the contempt of a man he barely knew. The stifled laughter of his colleagues burned his ears, as if each one was a cruel reminder that he didn't belong in that place. Inside, the young man begged that this was just a nightmare. But it wasn't. It was the naked and raw reality of a world where the humble had no place. His heart beat erratically, and for an instant Lucas thought about leaving everything, running away, and never coming back. But then, the image of his mother appeared in his mind, Doña Marta, with tired but hopeful eyes. He remembered her voice, firm and sweet. "Never let anyone tell you that you have no value, son. One day they're going to be surprised by you." Those words became the only thing that kept him from breaking down. Taking a deep breath, Lucas raised his eyes and faced Alberto. He said nothing, but inside he made a silent promise. That cruel phrase would not be the end of his story, but the beginning of his victory. One day, that man who laughed at his pain would have to swallow every word. The uncomfortable silence of the room dissolved when Alberto turned his back, confident that he had crushed the new intern's spirit. But what he didn't know was that he had just awakened something much stronger inside Lucas. The wound he opened would be the same one that, in the future, would reveal a strength he never imagined. At the end of the day, Lucas left the glass building feeling small, but not defeated. The cold of the night hit his face hard, but inside him, a flame grew. He knew his path would be hard, that the humiliations would be many. But in that instant, he understood that every word of contempt would transform into fuel. As he walked toward the bus stop, he looked back and saw the reflection of the illuminated skyscraper in the glass. It seemed unreachable, a world made only for the powerful. But Lucas smiled, even with tears in his eyes. One day, he would return there, not as an intern, but as someone impossible to ignore. He didn't know how or when, but he was certain of something. The phrase, "You'll never be anybody," would remain engraved in his memory. And it would be exactly that phrase that would drive him to prove otherwise. That was not the end. It was just the first chapter of his redemption. That night, Lucas could barely sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard Alberto's voice again, cold and cruel. "You'll never be anybody." The words resonated in his mind like chains, trapping him between shame and rage. He knew he had to return the next day, but the fear of reliving that humiliation suffocated him. Even so, at dawn he put on his simple shirt, adjusted his cheap tie, and left home. As he walked to the bus stop, he remembered the accumulated bills and his mother's tired look. He couldn't give up. The weight of responsibility pushed him forward, even when his will was to disappear. On the crowded bus, Lucas felt invisible among dozens of dejected faces. He observed workers who, like him, carried in their bodies and souls the weight of survival. He wondered how many of them were treated like nothing every day. That reflection burned in his chest, but also ignited a flame of silent revolt. Upon arriving at the company, the environment seemed even more hostile. Stifled giggles, contemptuous looks, and whispers followed his steps. It was as if they had already judged and condemned him, but Lucas refused to lower his head. He sat at his desk, took a deep breath, and immersed himself in the tasks, determined to show that his dignity would not be destroyed. Throughout the entire workday, he worked as if each spreadsheet were a battlefield. His hands trembled, not from weakness, but from contained fury. While Alberto passed by his side without even looking at him, Lucas transformed each order received into a brick to build his resistance. He knew that in silence, he was forging something greater. When the day ended, Lucas returned home with his body exhausted but his heart even heavier. Upon opening the door, he found Doña Marta smiling, although fragile from illness. Her embrace was the first time that day he felt seen. Suddenly, all the hardness of the world out there seemed smaller before the strength of his mother's love. Sitting at the table, he unburdened himself. He told about the laughter, the looks, and the cruel words. Doña Marta's tearful eyes filled with pain but also with firmness. Taking his hand, she said with a firm voice, "They can laugh at you, Lucas, but what matters isn't what they think. It's what you do with that. Show them who you are, but not with words. Show it with your achievements." Those words pierced Lucas like a ray of light in the midst of darkness. He realized he wasn't alone. The weight he carried was now shared with her, and that gave him unexpected strength. The pain continued to burn, but now it was accompanied by unbreakable determination. That night, lying in his bed, Lucas made a silent promise, not only to himself, but to his mother. He would transform every humiliation into a step, every cruel word into fuel. He wouldn't rest until he proved that the one they called nobody would become someone impossible to ignore. And so, with his heart full of wounds, but also of purpose, Lucas fell asleep. Without realizing it, he was just beginning to write a story that one day would make destiny itself bow before him. By the third day, Lucas already felt the weight of being in that hostile environment. The cold hallways of the company seemed to suffocate him. Every look pierced his skin like invisible knives. He worked in silence, trying not to attract attention, but the veiled jokes continued. It was as if every colleague was complicit in Alberto's cruelty. It was then that in the midst of the routine someone broke the pattern. Clara, a young analyst, approached discreetly. With a shy smile, she left a cup of coffee on Lucas's desk and said, "You don't deserve what they're doing to you. Stay strong." They were few words, but loaded with humanity. Lucas was left without reaction. He was used to receiving only coldness and contempt, and that simple gesture rekindled a spark of hope in him. For the first time, he felt he wasn't completely alone. Clara's kindness became a breath of air in the midst of daily suffocation. In the following days, Clara began to exchange quick words with him, always discreetly so as not to attract Alberto's wrath. Small gestures, a smile, advice, all of this made an immense difference. It was as if she saw in him something that no one else wanted to see. Worth. One afternoon, after another public humiliation from Alberto, Lucas was about to break down, but Clara found him in the hallway, touched his shoulder and said, "They want you to break. Prove they didn't succeed." That entered his soul like a cry of resistance. From that moment, Lucas decided he would endure. Not only for his mother, but also because now there was someone there who believed in him. The friendship with Clara didn't erase the pain, but it made it bearable. It was like a small flame that illuminated the darkness. But Alberto, always attentive and cruel, soon perceived that closeness. His predator's eyes narrowed, and he thought, "I'm not going to allow this boy to find strength in here." What for Lucas was hope, for Alberto became reason for even more cruelty. At the end of that day, Lucas left the company with a new feeling. There was still shame and pain, but also a spark of courage. He knew he couldn't count on many, but one ally was enough to make a difference. As he walked down the street, he looked at the dark sky of the city and felt determination growing in his chest. No matter how much it cost, he would resist. The newly born friendship was his proof that even in hell, humanity could still exist. And it was at that moment that Lucas realized the battle wouldn't just be against the arrogant boss, it would be against an entire system that didn't want to see him grow. But he had already decided he wouldn't step back. The opportunity arose sooner than Lucas expected. The management scheduled a crucial meeting to decide the future of an important project, and Alberto, with his venomous smile, announced that the new intern would be responsible for preparing all the supporting presentation. To others, it seemed like an opportunity. To Lucas, it was a trap. For consecutive nights, he dedicated himself to the work. He spent dawns reviewing reports, creating charts and adjusting every detail. His body asked for rest, but his mind burned with determination. He wanted to prove he was capable. He wanted to silence the laughter that still resonated within him. On the morning of the meeting, Lucas entered the room carrying his folder with all the organized material. His hands trembled, but his heart beat with hope. He discreetly looked at Clara, who gave him an encouraging look. It was the fuel he needed to face that moment. But Alberto had already set his blow. Before the meeting began, he changed some sheets, disordered data, and prepared everything to turn Lucas's presentation into a fiasco. The objective was clear: to humiliate him even more before management. When Lucas began to present, the first minutes were promising. But soon the numbers didn't add up. The chart seemed incoherent, and questions began to rain down. The young man felt the blood drain from his face. Alberto, sitting at the back, watched with a cruel smile, savoring every second. The discreet laughter of the directors cut like knives. Lucas tried to explain himself, but it seemed everything was against him. The humiliation grew every minute, and for an instant, he thought he would collapse right there. It was then that his eyes met Clara's again. Without saying anything, she looked at him firmly, as if silently shouting, "Don't give up!" That look made him take a deep breath and continue, even faced with shame. The pain was great, but even greater was his will to resist. The meeting ended in disaster. Alberto achieved what he wanted. Once again, Lucas was ridiculed before everyone. But upon leaving the room, he didn't feel only shame. He also felt rage. A silent rage that was beginning to transform into fuel. On his way home, with the empty folder in his hands, Lucas made himself a promise. Someday, the whole world would see what he was capable of, and no one would dare laugh at him. That night, Lucas arrived home carrying not only the weight of the empty folder, but also the feeling of absolute failure. The words of the directors, the stifled laughter, and Alberto's cruel smile hammered in his mind without mercy. He let himself fall on the bed and for the first time seriously thought about giving up. Lying in the darkness, silent tears ran down his face. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'll never be anybody, he whispered to himself. Doubt corroded his insides like poison. The young man who dreamed of a better life for his mother now saw himself sinking into an abyss of shame. However, a light cough from the next room awakened him from self-pity. It was his mother. He entered slowly and saw her sitting on the bed, trying to hide her pain with a smile. Upon noticing her son's tearful eyes, she didn't ask anything. She just opened her arms. Lucas surrendered to the embrace and cried like a child. It was then that she said with a weak but firm voice, "Son, don't fight just for yourself. Fight also for me. Fight for all those who never had a chance. If you give up, they win." Those words hit Lucas directly in the heart. He pulled away and looked into her eyes. He didn't see pity or desperation. He only saw faith. Faith that he could transform pain into strength. It was then that he understood. Giving up was no longer an option, not only for him, but because carrying that weight was also the way to honor his mother's struggle. That dawn, instead of sleeping, Lucas opened the old laptop he had bought secondhand. With still trembling hands, he began to research, study, and learn. Each keystroke was an act of resistance. Each page read was a step toward change. While the world slept, he rebuilt himself in silence. The boy humiliated in the office was now an invisible warrior, forging his strength in the shadows. He still didn't have a clear plan, but he had the determination not to bend. The sun rose and found Lucas still awake, with red eyes but with new energy in his chest. The temptation to give up had transformed into a promise. He wouldn't step back. Someday, he would make every humiliation be remembered as the beginning of his victory. And so, in the silence of dawn, the new Lucas was born. No longer just a humiliated intern, but a young man who had decided to fight against all those who doubted him. From that night on, Lucas's routine changed. During the day, he was the invisible intern, target of mockery and contempt. But at night, when he arrived home, he transformed into a tireless student. He spent entire nights immersed in books on administration, finance, and technology. His body asked for rest, but his mind screamed for knowledge. With each new discovery, Lucas felt his confidence grow, although no one knew it. He was building something silent, something that someday would make all that suffering worthwhile. While Alberto laughed and treated him as useless, Lucas absorbed every detail of the work, learning from mistakes and silently observing the company's functioning. Like a sponge, he absorbed everything, preparing for the right moment to show his worth. One night, Clara noticed he was staying longer than everyone at the office. She approached and found Lucas writing in his notebook, scribbling calculations and ideas. "Are you still here?" she asked, surprised. Lucas just smiled and replied, "Someday I'm going to need all this. I want to be ready." Clara observed him in silence, realizing there was something different there. It wasn't just a young man trying to survive. It was someone determined to challenge the impossible. And that perception made her come even closer, becoming not just a friend but a silent accomplice to his dreams. The nights became the stage for Lucas's transformation. Each dawn in front of the computer was an act of resistance against the destiny Alberto tried to impose on him. He wasn't just studying, he was rebuilding himself. The physical exhaustion was devastating. Many times his eyes closed and his head fell on the keyboard, but it was enough to remember his mother's smile or the boss's contemptuous look for the flame to rekindle. It was that mixture of love and rage that kept him standing. Deep down, Lucas already knew. Life wouldn't give him anything on a silver platter. But he also knew that if he continued, he could build something that no one could steal from him. Every sacrifice made now would be rewarded in the future. That night, as he closed the laptop and looked at the starry sky through the window, Lucas whispered, "I'm nobody yet, but one day everyone will remember my name." And so, with the strength of determination, Lucas sealed his destiny. The sleepless nights would be his greatest sacrifice, but also his most powerful weapon against Alberto's arrogance. Without anyone noticing, Lucas's effort was beginning to bear fruit. On a seemingly ordinary afternoon, a problem arose in an important report. The team panicked as the numbers didn't add up and the deadline had passed. It was then that timidly, Lucas raised his hand and asked to try to solve it. Alberto mocked, You're going to make us waste time." But Lucas stood firm. In a few minutes, he reorganized the data and found the error that everyone had overlooked. The silence of the room was broken by a sigh of amazement. For the first time, the nobody showed he knew more than he seemed. Clara smiled discreetly, proud, while some colleagues whispered surprised. Alberto, for his part, swallowed hard, feeling the threat in every line corrected by Lucas. But he couldn't admit it. He just forced a bitter laugh and said, "Even a broken clock is right twice a day." Even faced with devaluation, Lucas felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Pride. Not only for having solved the problem, but for having proven to himself that he was capable. That small triumph was like a ray of light piercing through the heavy clouds that suffocated him. That night, when he told his mother about it, he saw tears of joy in her eyes. "See, son? They can try to extinguish you, but your light will shine anyway," said Doña Marta, squeezing his hands tenderly. Those words resonated in his soul. Lucas perceived that his battle wasn't just against Alberto. It was against all the voices that tried to convince him he had no value. And that day, he had shown he could win, even if in small steps. As he walked back to the bus stop, he felt his chest swell with determination. The world still laughed at him, but now there was a difference. For the first time, he himself was beginning to believe in his potential. The glimmer of a small conquest might seem little to many. But for Lucas, it was the sign that his fight was just beginning. And what he still didn't know was that each victory of his also became one more reason for Alberto to want to destroy him. In the following days, Lucas's presence began to disturb more and more. Small, discreet compliments from colleagues, comments about his intelligence, and even Clara's admiring look ignited the flame of envy in Alberto. The boss couldn't stand the idea that nobody could gain space within the company. It was then that he decided to act. In private meetings, he began to spread rumors. "That boy isn't trustworthy," he said with his voice loaded with authority. And as many feared Alberto, his word was enough to sow doubt. In a short time, some colleagues who previously spoke with Lucas began to avoid him. Lucas perceived the change in the air. Distrustful looks, whispers around him, and even the coldness of people who previously greeted him. It was as if an invisible shadow pursued him. He didn't understand the reason, but felt the weight of rejection growing again. Clara, perceiving what was happening, called him aside. "It's Alberto. He's poisoning everyone against you, but don't let that break you." Lucas sighed deeply, feeling rage grow. It was no longer just humiliation. It was persecution. Despite the pain, Lucas maintained calm. He knew that reacting with explosions would only strengthen the enemy. He decided to continue studying, work in silence, and wait for the right moment to show who he really was. But Alberto didn't retreat. With an even lower blow, he convinced colleagues to hide information from Lucas, making his work difficult. Silent traps arose in every task, transforming simple reports into true trials by fire. The objective was clear: make Lucas fail until he gave up. And it was exactly in one of those traps that Lucas almost lost control. Upon discovering they had omitted data on purpose, he felt rage burn like never before. His closed fist trembled. The urge to scream was immense. But he took a deep breath and said to himself, "If I fall into his game, he wins." That night, lying unable to sleep, Lucas looked at the ceiling and made another promise. He wouldn't allow Alberto's evil to destroy him. If the boss was willing to play dirty, he would be willing to fight with intelligence. And so, the battle ceased to be just professional. It became personal, a silent duel in which every step of Lucas was watched, and every error would be used against him. But Alberto didn't know that. The more he tried to extinguish Lucas, the stronger was the flame that was born within him. The climate inside the company was suffocating. Lucas already knew that every movement was watched. Every small error transformed into a reason for mockery. But in the midst of pressure, something unexpected happened. An idea began to grow within him. Something big, capable of changing not only his life, but the course of the company itself. It was simple and brilliant at the same time. A system that would reduce costs and increase profits, taking advantage of resources that everyone ignored. Inspired by the difficulties he had lived in real life, Lucas saw solutions where others only saw problems. He spent sleepless nights scribbling calculations, writing proposals, and dreaming of the day when he could present it. Clara, seeing his notebooks full of annotations, was impressed. "Lucas, this is incredible. If someone saw this idea, you would be truly recognized," she said enthusiastically. But Lucas hesitated. He knew Alberto would never allow his voice to be heard. Even so, courage spoke louder. He gathered strength and decided to take the proposal to the boss. Trembling with nerves, he entered Alberto's office and put the folder on the desk. "Sir, I think this could be useful for the company." Alberto leafed through for a few seconds and then laughed. "Who do you think you are? A slum kid wanting to teach business to me?" he mocked, tearing part of the papers in front of Lucas. "You'll never be more than a useless intern. Don't get your hopes up." The words fell like stones, crushing any spark of hope. Lucas left the office with his heart shattered, containing tears that threatened to fall. But deep down, a flame burned even stronger. He knew his idea had value. And although Alberto tried to destroy him, someday that proposal would find the right eyes. That night, lying in his bed, Lucas made a silent promise. If the boss didn't believe in him, someone would. And when that happened, Alberto would be forced to swallow every cruel word. Destiny doesn't delay in acting when someone fights in silence. Days later, during a coffee break, Lucas was quietly talking with Clara about his proposal. He didn't know it, but a well-dressed and discreet man overheard part of the conversation from a nearby table. He was an investor visiting the company in search of new talents. Intrigued, the man approached and asked, "Young man, I heard you talking about cost reduction and innovation. Can you explain it better?" Lucas, surprised and hesitant, opened the folder and showed some sketches he still preserved. The investor remained silent for a few minutes, studying every detail. Then he smiled and said, "You have something big here, something that can change many things." Lucas's heart raced. For the first time, someone saw in him more than an invisible intern. Clara, beside him, discreetly squeezed his hand, excited about what was happening. It was as if finally life was offering him a crack of light. But Alberto didn't take long to notice. Upon seeing the investor talking with Lucas, he quickly approached, interrupting the scene. With his authoritative tone, he said, "Don't waste time with this boy, sir. He doesn't understand anything about business." The investor simply looked at him, serious, and replied, "Sometimes true talent emerges from where we least expect it." Alberto felt the ground tremble under his feet. For the first time, someone challenged his authority. The contemptuous smile he always wore gave way to an expression of contained rage. In that instant, he understood that Lucas wasn't just an intern. He was a threat. That night, Lucas returned home unable to sleep. His mind boiled with a mixture of fear and hope. For the first time, he had the opportunity to prove his worth. But he also knew that Alberto would do everything possible to prevent it. The young man looked at the ceiling and murmured, "If destiny gave me this opportunity, I won't waste it. They'll see. Everyone will see who I really am." And so, in the silence of dawn, the humiliated boy prepared for a confrontation that would change his life forever. The investor's look at Lucas was like poison to Alberto. The arrogance that always sustained him now mixed with fear. He knew that if that humble boy gained space, his own throne would be threatened. It was then that he decided he would do everything to destroy Lucas. Days later, Alberto appeared smiling, calling Lucas to his office. "I have heard you have an interesting idea. Let me analyze it better. I promise we'll look at this calmly." The tone was soft, but his eyes betrayed the falsehood. Lucas, distrustful, hesitated, but without many options he handed over part of the material. That same night, Alberto gathered his allies and presented the proposal as if it were his own. "Look, it's brilliant, and of course it came from my mind." Laughter from flatterers filled the room. Meanwhile, Lucas, at home, felt a knot in his chest without knowing exactly what was about to come. Clara soon discovered the betrayal. She ran into Lucas's office, panting, "He stole your idea. He's presenting it as if it were his." Lucas's world seemed to crumble. Everything he had built in sleepless nights was now being used against him. Rage burned in his veins, but at the same time, fear paralyzed him. Who would believe him against the powerful Alberto? He was nothing more than an intern. If he dared to confront him, he could lose everything. But if he remained silent, his soul would die little by little. That dawn, Lucas cried in silence, but then dried his tears and looked at his notebooks. He still had proof, sketches and dates that showed the idea had been born in his hands. He had no power, but he had the truth. Standing in front of the mirror, he murmured to himself, "They want to silence me, but I won't be silenced. If I have to risk everything, so be it. Better to fall fighting than to live humiliated." And it was in that instant that Lucas made the riskiest decision of his life. He would confront Alberto, even if it was in front of everyone. The big business event arrived. Luxurious hall, journalists, investors, and executives gathered to hear new proposals. It was the showcase where names were made, or destroyed. Alberto, confident, walked across the stage with his arrogant posture. In his hands, he carried the idea he had stolen. At the back of the auditorium, Lucas watched, with his heart racing. Beside him, Clara squeezed his hand tightly as if wanting to transmit courage. "If you don't do anything today, Alberto wins forever," she whispered. Lucas took a deep breath. He knew that was the decisive moment. Alberto began his speech eloquently. The charts and calculations that Lucas had prepared in endless nights were displayed on enormous screens. The audience applauded, enchanted with the proposal. For everyone, Alberto was the genius of innovation. But for Lucas, each applause sounded like a stab, until something unexpected happened. The investor who had noticed Lucas days before raised his hand and asked, "Excellent idea, Alberto, but tell me, how exactly did you have this insight?" The boss stammered for an instant without a convincing answer. It was at that moment that Lucas felt the opportunity was born. With his heart about to explode, he stood up from his seat and said with a firm voice, "That idea didn't come from him. It came from me." The hall fell silent. All eyes turned to the young intern in simple clothes, who dared to challenge the most feared man in the company. Alberto tried to laugh. This boy is delusional, an inexperienced intern wanting credit for something so complex. But Lucas didn't retreat. He raised his folder and showed notebooks full of notes, dates, and original sketches. "Here is the truth. Every detail, every calculation, I made them." A murmur took over the auditorium. The investor approached to see the evidence and, after a few seconds, confirmed, "It's true. He's telling the truth." Alberto paled. The entire hall now looked at the young man who, until recently, had been invisible. In that instant, Lucas understood. It didn't matter if he would emerge victorious or not. He had recovered his voice, and that courage would be the weapon that would change his story forever. The hall was in complete silence. On one side, Alberto, powerful and arrogant, now sweating cold before the evidence. On the other, Lucas, firm, exhibiting his notebook scribbled with nights of sacrifice. It was the clash of two worlds, arrogance against perseverance. Alberto tried to react, raising his voice. "This is absurd. He must have falsified these papers. Are you going to believe a poor intern instead of me?" But the more he shouted, the more he betrayed himself. His mask of confidence began to crack before everyone. The investor spoke. "Alberto, I always admired your career. But today, I see that you tried to steal a young man's future to sustain your ego. That's unacceptable." The words resonated like a death sentence for the arrogant boss. Murmurs of disapproval arose from the audience. Lucas, still trembling inside, raised his voice. "For a long time I was told I would never be anybody. But the truth is that no one can steal what you build with sweat and sacrifice. I am somebody. I always was. They just tried to make me believe otherwise." The applause began timid, but soon grew to fill the hall. The audience stood up, giving an ovation to the intern who dared to face the most feared man in the company. Clara cried in silence, proud, while Lucas felt his heart explode with emotion. Alberto, humiliated, left the stage with his head down. For the first time there were no applause for him, only contemptuous looks. The empire of arrogance crumbled before the truth. Lucas came down from the stage, still panting. He didn't know what would come next, but in that instant something was certain. He had won the biggest battle of his life. But he didn't know that that victory wouldn't just be personal. It would also change the course of the company and his own story forever. The next morning, the news was already in all the newspapers. "Intern unmasks boss at millionaire event," said the headlines. Lucas, the previously invisible boy, was now recognized as an example of courage and resilience. Management had no choice. Alberto was removed, accused of fraud and abuse of power. His years of arrogance finally took their toll. The man who said, "You'll never be anybody," was now remembered only as a symbol of shame. Meanwhile, Lucas was called to a special meeting with investors. They offered him the opportunity to lead the development of his idea in a new company. It was the opportunity he had always dreamed of, not only to prove his worth, but to change his life and his mother's forever. Excited, Lucas ran home. Doña Marta waited for him on the porch with the same tired smile as always. Upon seeing him arrive, her son hugged her tightly with tears running down his face. "Mom, I did it. They finally saw who I am." She cried with him, stroking his hair. "I always saw it, son. I always knew." Those words were Lucas's true reward, more than applause, contracts, or headlines. It was the pride in his mother's eyes that gave it meaning. That night, lying in his simple bed, he reflected on everything, from humiliation to tears, from sleepless nights to triumph before the audience. He understood that every wound was necessary to mold his strength. And closing his eyes, he smiled in silence. Alberto's phrase resonated in his mind. "You'll never be anybody." But now it no longer hurt. On the contrary, it was the reminder that he had proven exactly the opposite. Lucas not only became somebody, he became unforgettable. Months passed since that day in the hall. Lucas now walked through the city streets with his head high, not as the humiliated intern, but as the young man who dared to believe in himself when everyone doubted. His idea had transformed into a new company, a project that grew week by week, bringing innovation and opportunities. More than financial success, Lucas built something much greater, a space where no one was treated as nobody. There, every employee was heard, every voice had value. He had transformed pain into purpose and suffering into strength to not repeat Alberto's mistakes. One quiet afternoon, he visited his mother at home. Doña Marta, now stronger, received him with tears in her eyes upon seeing her son fulfilled. "You won, son. But more than winning, you showed that we must never believe when they say we're not capable." Lucas smiled and replied, "I only won because I was never alone. You always believed in me." As he walked on the porch watching the sunset, Lucas reflected, Life always tests us, always places obstacles. But the difference lies in how we respond. Some let themselves be destroyed. Others, like him, use each stone to build steps. The echo of Alberto's phrase still resonated in his mind. You'll never be anybody. But now it didn't hurt. It was just the memory of a time when the world didn't believe in him. Today, it was proof that true greatness isn't born from arrogance, but from resilience. Lucas raised his eyes to the sky and whispered to himself, "No one can steal the value that exists within you. Only you decide whether to believe it or not." And perhaps that's the greatest lesson. It doesn't matter how much they tell you that you're not capable. What matters is what you do with that. Because in the end, the only voice that really defines your future is your own. If this story touched you, remember, never accept being called nobody. You have value, you have purpose, and sometimes all that destiny waits for is for you to believe in yourself.